Hi, I'm Hank Thomas. It's my honor today to moderate the panel Out of Body, Composing Blackness Through Sound, Music, and Performing Art. The panelists are Matthew Morrison, NYU, Black Resonance and All That Jazz in European Cosmopolitanism is the title. Nikki Greene, Wellesley, Facing the Music. Radcliffe Bailey, Sun Ra, and the African Diaspora Body. Kwami Coleman, NYU. The New Thing. Redefining Postwar Black Musical Experimentation. Courtney Bryan, Princeton University.
She's not here.
Oh, she's not here, sorry. Imani Uzuri, Columbia University. She came traveling, performing Diaspora through migration, memory, mythology, and music. Each panelist will have 12 minutes, and there'll be a brief question-answer period at the end of the panel.
So I'll begin. Can you hear me out there? Great. My name is Kwami Coleman. I'm a postdoctoral fellow and assistant professor at New York University, the Gallatin School of Individualized Study. My paper, or my presentation rather, is entitled The New Thing in 1960s Jazz, Redefining Post-War Black Experimentalism. And I have here the cover of a 1965 album featuring John Coltrane and Archie Shepp, two tenor saxophonists, called The New Thing at Newport, which was the Newport Jazz Festival in 1965. Kind of a controversial concert, and the reasons will be made clearer the further I go into this paper. So, you with me? Yes. Great.
Yes, this is the sound panel, so we're all about it.
Yeah. So, by 1959, jazz epitomized American modernism in the United States and abroad, representing both in sound and image the dual ethos of artistic sophistication and cultural progressivism, and symbolizing the inherent reconciliatory power and future promises of racial integration. Black musicians and the highly improvised music that they played reached an unprecedented degree of cultural legitimacy, and jazz, having largely shed its dance music connotation, was no longer simply an exotic form of entertainment. The evident virtuosity and complexity of bebop, the style pioneered by intrepid young musicians like Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and Bud Powell during and after World War II, was widely understood to be music for engaged and serious listening. Catalyzing this view was a blossoming trade journal industry devoted to scrutinizing artists and recordings as the subjects of serious and detailed theoretical, historical, and comparative analyses. And these magazines inevitably and indelibly shaped consumer taste by pointing them to the best live and recorded jazz available for commercial consumption. By 1959, publications like Downbeat, Metronome, The Jazz Review, Jazz and Record Changer in the United States, Coda in Canada, Le Cahier du Jazz and Jazz Magazine in France, Jazz Journal and Melody Maker in the United Kingdom, and others across Europe instilled the idea that jazz was an important cultural expression, thereby thrusting Black musicians into the very center of a vibrant post-war transatlantic intellectual discourse on an unprecedented scale. This framing was further enhanced by public television programs in the United States and Europe that featured artists like Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Nina Simone, and other musicians in intimate and artfully staged performances that depicted them as serious and thoughtful artists. By the start of the 1960s, jazz recordings, both new and reissues from previous years, were pressed in record numbers and fed through global distribution networks consisting of independent and corporate commercial firms, record companies. And iconic musicians like Louis Armstrong were deployed by the State Department as goodwill ambassadors to smoothen relations between and instilling American values in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. However, it was in 1959, the same year that Miles Davis recorded Kind of Blue, that a, quote, new thing in jazz emerge, sparking a fierce controversy that would smolder throughout the decade and beyond. Alto saxophonist Ornette Coleman, a Texas-born Los Angeles transplant, burst suddenly onto the highly competitive New York City scene with a several-week-long engagement at the Five Spot Cafe in the East Village, an unheard-of opportunity for an unknown out-of-towner who had not established himself through traditional apprenticeship channels. Coleman, who secured a recording contract with Atlantic Records that same year, performed and produced recordings that challenged the prevailing link between jazz and modernism. He was accused by critics and other musicians for making music that was too modern, or even worse, that was in danger of destroying the jazz tradition. Coleman and other emergent musicians like Cecil Taylor, Archie Shepp, Don Ellis, and Eric Dolphy, as well as more established musicians like John Coltrane, embodied a radical new thing movement in jazz, and as such, effectively disrupted the prevailing notions of the music's teleology, and accessibility in critical jazz literature. If the case for jazz as a modern art form was made precisely because critics could subject recordings to music analysis and ensure the listener a fulfilling, aesthetically pleasing experience, the new thing made no such promises. Some critics and musicians found the new music incomprehensible and obstreperous, a sure sign of charlatanry and aesthetic decline. But for other less reactionary critics and musicians interested in new modes of expression, this experimental new thing offered new musical possibilities. My presentation today explores how the new thing, alternately called free and avant-garde jazz, was a unique movement of musical experimentation that was initially met by critics with skepticism or confusion. But as the 1960s progressed and black musicians became more vocal about social, economic, and political injustice and exploitation, it was increasingly maligned and became the sonic representation of angry black anti-integrationist or black nationalist separatist politics. I will also present an alternate reading or listening of that experimentation by playing a few representative examples and showing how familiar forms and conventions were tested out and played with by these artists in a way that made a lasting impact on musicians who did enjoy mainstream success, musicians like Miles Davis. I want to close the presentation with a few open questions about the problematic legacy of the objective criticism of experimental black artwork and how, in this case, it was resistant to the neat, traditional, formalist analyses and classification by mostly white critics. That the music did not conform to their ideas of modernist jazz tradition, one that reflected a broader integrationalist and countercultural agenda, led to its being written into the margins of jazz history, a form of epistemic violence that still remains with us today. I want to end by suggesting a way to listen to this music and perhaps understanding experimental music by black artists in particular, which acknowledges how abstraction, fragmentation, and a focus on different musical parameters like density, momentum, collectivity, wielded through highly personalized compositional and improvisational styles, unlock new ways to imagine and experience music. So, oh.
You went in.
Thank you.
I said, I'm not done yet.
So, the new thing, what is the new thing? The new thing was one of many terms like free jazz, avant-garde jazz, out jazz, fire music, new wave, and others that signified the diverse experimental approaches to music creation and performance in the 1960s. There's really no uniform new thing. There are, however, common techniques used in experimental improvised music in this historical moment. Some of those techniques are the fragmentation of melodies and melodic material, abstract harmonies and harmonic textures, the spontaneous creation of melody and/or harmony, the recomposition of a piece's structural elements in performance, which is what we call improvisation, drones and pedal points, non-traditional or non-Western instruments, electric instruments like the electric guitar, electric keyboard, wide ranges of ensemble and timbral density, fluctuating or free meter, and a focus on producing action and energy-based performances that were unrestrained, intuitive, and emotionally raw. These attributes made it very difficult to subject the new thing to traditional Western harmonic analyses, a tool used by critics to uncover a piece's order and design, and frankly, the aptitude and importance of a musician in question. With the new thing, the relationship between content and form was abstract or obscure, and it was assumed that the music was an emotional, read, illogical outpouring of underdeveloped musicians. Much of Ornette Coleman's early work was described this way, and he appeared to critics to have jettisoned most of, if not all, of the conventions of traditional jazz composition and performance. For example, a letter from a reader was published in the Chords and Discords column of the December 24th, 1959 issue of Downbeat magazine, a publication founded in 1934 that focused heavily on jazz and the blues. This letter addressed the controversy and sided over Coleman's music. John Mahegan, the letter's author and self-identified critic and pianist, wrote, and I have a clip for you here, "I assume Ornette is sincere, but what he is doing certainly has nothing to do with jazz, and I'm afraid very little to do with music in any form. First of all, he does not swing. Neither does his rhythm section for that matter. Most of Ornette's playing seems to consist of endless noodling around one chord with occasional flurry of non-diatonic tones. Compared to Rollins, Coltrane, Getz, and not to mention Charlie Parker, Coleman is a fumbling neophyte." In the album review section of the same magazine, staff writer Don DeMichael reviews Coleman's Tomorrow's the Question LP. You can see that here. DeMichael writes, "To say this is a strange album is an understatement. Astonishing comes closer to the mark, for the LP is an exposition of Coleman's conception. If it's anything, this conception is astonishing. Most of his playing on this LP is very good, but some of it is outrageous. His wild, incoherent solos on the track, Tomorrow, Tears, and Mine are marked by extremely bad intonation and sloppy execution. All in all, this record demands attention and must be listened to many times before it can be digested even partly. Ornette Coleman may be the next great influence, but only time will tell. In the meantime, he should be heard so that a fair evaluation can be made." So, I can theorize a little more on what I mean by experimentation, and I'd like to connect it to how scholars like Fred Moten theorize a radical black tradition, but I'm rapidly running out of time, and I want to play music for you. So I'm going to fast forward. I want to play for you now an excerpt from Ornette Coleman's 1962 recording Free Jazz, which is basically where we get the name Free Jazz. Okay, so before we play it, what you're listening to is basically a double quartet playing together, engaging in one big conversation with each other. You may hear it and think that it's completely random, but it's actually a very traditional structure. Most of us are aware that in a jazz performance we have the head statement, the melody, a series of solos, and then the melody comes back. This follows that same scheme, except the head melody is a series of rapid independent lines played by all of the 8 musicians, followed by a series of long notes in unison. Then that's followed by alternating solos. Each of the 8 musicians plays a solo. The other ones kind of come in and comment on the soloist as he is playing. And then the head section comes back. So why don't we play that clip, please? This is the long notes. This is the first solo. So as you can see, it's basically one big conversation that's not really being pulled in any one direction. Everyone's kind of listening to each other and shaping all together. I'm rapidly running out of time, so I'll just play maybe 1 or 2 more tunes. The next one is Cecil Taylor playing actually, I'll move past it. This is Cecil Taylor on a recording produced by Gil Evans, who's standing right there. Instead, I'm going to play for you Cecil Taylor's abstract blues called Modestrophe. Is this it? Yes. pretty conventional for a so-called extreme avant-gardist. Okay, so I really have no more time, but I'll play one more clip to you, and to show, I don't mean to disrespect, but I just want to drive this point home. To show how influential these ideas were, I'll play now this recording by Miles Davis, a 1967 recording. It was recorded live. This is his now abstract version of Round Midnight. Okay, we can turn down the volume. So in the interest of time, abstraction, fragmentation, intensity, momentum, different textures, and collectivity, these are different ways in which we can think about this music that has been historically maligned, and I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
My name is Imani Uzuri. I'm a vocalist, composer, cultural worker, and a new grad student in African American Studies. And I'm excited to be here. I just want to first say thank you, a special thank you to Deb Willis for having us very much. It's wonderful. And also a special thank you to Matthew D. Morrison, who conceptualized this panel. It's an honor to be here, the Black Portraitures. I am a traveler. I have communed with Sufis in Morocco and sung laments with comrades in Hungary. I have danced with the Bifal in Senegal and drank the holy Zamzam water. I come from a family of quilters, moonshine makers, sinners, and saints. As an artist and an aesthete, I travel to find myself. As one who strongly identifies as a displaced person, I gather the pieces that I am. All of these experiences as a woman of the world have been deeply informed by my core identity as a rural, southern-raised Black girl. These investigations are my foundation and my wings as I continue to become who I be and shape my identity as a daughter of the diaspora. So the title of my talk is She Came Traveling, Performing Diaspora Through Migration, Memory, Mythology, and Music. I drape myself in fabric and sound. I carry my culture out into the world, the melodies, the guttural, the utterances, and the poetics of my Black ancestors. As I also seek pieces of myself in other cultural forms. As a traveler, I seek the connections of my perceived and real Africanisms and my place in the larger world. I am a collage of mythology, memory, and music. My compositional and performative work is a culled-together mosaic of connections. My interest in folkloric traditions from my own rural Southern Black American experiences have helped me connect to folks from all over the world and their various traditions and vernacular cultures. Within the tradition of the traveling blues woman, my life as an artist has provided me agency to see the world. My interest as a cultural worker has provided my pedagogy and methodology of engagement. My rural Black American Southern mores and ways have been my doorway to a deeper engagement with others from around the globe. My paper will unpack my notions of a shifting self as I move through the world. We can play the first track. She came traveling from far away over land and sea. Her spirit said, return to me, give birth and be free. Her spirit said, return to me, give birth and be free. Her spirit said, return to me, give birth and be free. performing diaspora, what does that mean for me as a performing artist? Look at me. I mean, I look like something. When I travel around the world, from Morocco to Moscow to Japan, people are always stopping, asking me where I'm from. And when I talked about earlier, this idea of perceived Africanisms. I'm a black nationalist culturally, and I'm also a person who believes in cultural appropriation in a benevolent way. And that's why I'm just like, I don't know, I'm wearing some fabric from India, I got a dress from Russia, you know, I'm just trying to do it. But as far as like carrying black sound, we have a lot of black performers who travel around the world, from Nina Simone to Josephine Baker, from the Clara Ward singers. We have Max Roach, Fitz Jubilee singers, Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson. All of these are performers who have carried aspects of black sound throughout the world. Today I want to specifically focus on people who actually, which is what I tend to do when I travel, is I make a point to carry more a black vernacular aesthetic, specifically focus on the African American spirituals. The spirituals are the foundation for black American music, pretty much American music. Our ancestor now, B.B. King, said that blues are the mother of American music. And I like to say within the Negro spiritual must be the grandmother of American music. So when we think about Marian Anderson, who traveled around the world in opera houses all around the world, from Italy to beyond, she would sing a more classically arranged version of what we call an African American spiritual. And before that, the first people who propagated kind of black American sound in the whole world would be Fitz Jubilee singers, who at the end of slavery started a choir where they did classical arrangements of these spirituals and would travel around the world and sing them. Singing for queens and other people. So for me, when I do travel, I make a point to always sing a spiritual wherever I go, because that is my foundation. I grew up in rural North Carolina. I grew up line singing hymns. I grew up singing, in just a really small rural church. And I just feel like it's important when I represent my blackness aesthetically, the way I dress, this kind of mosaic of blackness, but I definitely want to make sure that I represent this kind of basic, rich, simplistic, and profound at the same time black vernacular voice. I think that's very important. And because a lot of people have stereotypes of what it means to be black as a performer. Some people think you're a loose woman, which I am a loose woman, but some people think I'm available for them. And people also, I'll tell you one example. When I went to Siberia to sing about a year ago, it was a concert of jazz musicians, Russian jazz musicians, and I wanted to sing a work song, and they wanted me to scat in the middle of a work song. And I was very offended. But what I understand as a performer who travels and carrying my black sounds with me is that people have projections of what blackness means based on all type of stereotypes or based on their own mythology that they have projected onto me. And so even though I'm a walking mythology, I definitely like to ground myself in a reality. And I said it's not appropriate to scat doobie-doo-wop on a work song, so no. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Oh, good, I got 5 minutes. All right, cool. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna sing, because a lot of people, I was gonna talk a lot more, but people kept asking me to sing, and at first I was kind of like, why I gotta sing? I'm trying to be smart, I'm trying to talk. But then I realized, I should just do what I actually do really best, is sing. So I'm gonna sing a couple of, I'm gonna start with a line singing a hymn, a more vernacular form of a hymn. The hymn is written by an English hymn writer, but I'm singing in a very black American aesthetic, a slow meter. So I'm just going to sing it. This is one of my mother's, Virginia Gilbert's favorite one. It's called Bread of Heaven. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah. Guide me, O thou. While you're listening, pay attention to my the guttural sounds that I'm using. Pay attention to how I'm using my mouth, and I'm using all these earthy sounds, chesty sounds, and I'm not trying to sound pretty. I'm trying to sing for the Lord. Yeah. Okay. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrims through this thou powerful hand. This is when it get good to you right now. Here we go. Bread of heaven. Come on, y'all. One bread of heaven. Feed me till I won't no more. If you know it, sing it with me. Bread of heaven. Bread of heaven. Bread of heaven. Feed me till I won't no more.
Yes. Come on now.
So, the last thing and thank you all so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And the last thing I'll sing, which actually I'll have you sing with me. So imagine wherever I go, if I'm in Bali, if I haven't been yet, but when I go, I'm going to sing a song like that.
Okay.
Wherever I go, I just want to represent those sounds because those are also sounds that we don't often hear right now in popular music as much. And, I feel like it's important to keep that those are the sounds of our ancestors, and they understood something about surviving. They understood something about thriving. They understood the importance. We don't just randomly use melismas when we sing in this tradition. We're not just using it for decoration. It actually does something to your body, whether you can sing like Aretha Franklin or not. You singing and using your own voice and using these sounds can do something for you. So with that ending, I'm just going to sing something I know y'all should know, Wade in the Water, and we're going to have y'all sing it with me, and then we'll end my little part of the thing. Wade in the water. Come on, y'all. Wade in the water. Okay, really, we're going to be in Florence, and y'all really not going to represent the Black Portraitures? Really?
Okay.
All right. 1, 2, 3, go. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the... Bring it up, bring it. Wade in the water. So clap. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the war. Oh, God's gonna trouble the war. Oh, God's gonna trouble the water. Thank you.
Amen. Come on now, sister. Come on, Afrofuturism. Yes.
Okay. Speaking of water, Radcliffe Bailey records the historical forces. Let me stop. Thank you.
Okay.
That's amazing. I should preface this that this is just a sample of some of the work I've been doing for my book project, which is entitled Rhythms of Glue, Grease, Grime, and Glitter: The Body in Contemporary African American Art. And this is really another step for me in trying to figure out funk. And I wrote about Renee Stout and what I call a feminist funk power. Betty Davis, one of the many wives of Miles Davis, Betty Davis and Renee Stout in conversation with this. So this is another iteration of me looking for how to center funk as a genre within art history. So Radcliffe Bailey records the historical forces of the Middle Passage, slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow segregation in the South, the Civil Rights Movement, all of these important issues pertaining to Black life to the present day. As noted by the curator David Moose, Bailey's, quote, artistic project seeks to restore a sense of honor to a brutalized historical identity. So in Bailey's seminal installation, Windward Coast, I examine how a sea of hundreds of disengaged piano keys fill the gallery space and take on an Afrofuturist vibe as a disembodied, charcoal black, sparkling head seemingly floats, operating as a space of psychedelic redemption vis-a-vis Sun Ra. So I'll begin with him, and I will ask you to travel with me. Sun Ra is Radcliffe Bailey's favorite musician. He's had a tremendous influence on him as an artist. And I will relate some facts that many of you may be already familiar with, but he was born in 1914 in Birmingham, Alabama, died in 1993, and he's known as one of the pioneers of free jazz, and we already had an introduction to that. And he was a leader of what one refers to today as Afrofuturism, even before the term was coined by Mark Derry in 1994, because Sun Ra really lived out many of those principles. And it's a term that's commonly associated with Black science fiction. John Swed, who is one of Sun Ra's biographers, and quote him, he says, Afrofuturism is where the material culture of Afro-American folk religions are used as sacred technologies to control virtual realities. And we saw a kind of celebration and a documentation of Sun Ra's influence on Afrofuturism in the Studio Museum's recent exhibition, The Shadows Took Shape. I don't know how many of you got a chance to see that last year. Sun Ra believed that he was born on the planet of Saturn. And accordingly, music was, and dare I say is, especially with my esteemed panelists, that it is a way by which Black people can transcend another plane, another space. Feel like we kind of did that for a moment a few minutes ago. Amiri Baraka wrote about him throughout the mid to late 1960s. In the 1969 book of essays, Black Music, he states the following: "It is science fact that Sun Ra is interested in, not science fiction. It is evolution itself and its fruits, God as evolution, the flow of is." So unfortunately, this song is 10 minutes long. So with that, that's just an introduction to other planes of there. There's a way in which it rescinds the transparency of Blackness posited by cosmic liberalism, that is Afrofuturism, and asserts simply and boldly that space is the place for Black people. Minor keys, in particular, was constructed by Bailey to look like a fish tank, where one could dive in as deep into an ocean while also simultaneously flying high for deep space exploration. Minor keys effectively calls out for the viewer to cross yet another threshold between earth and sky ocean and space through the vehicle of music. The black encaustic minor keys are arranged within the frame of a piano, reflecting this kind of Afrofuturism where one can find a form of black pride in the music itself, in the instruments themselves, in order to sort of arrive at an intergalactic connectedness. Thus, in minor keys, the brightly painted Saturn represents Sun Ra, one of many iterations of a portrait of the funk musician by Radcliffe. And he's explained that his works function less as paintings, as is the case in many of the examples that were represented in his retrospective Memory as Medicine. They are enclosed assemblages that hang as a representative medicine cabinet, a familiar site of healing in anyone's home. This is appropriate for Bailey, who identifies very closely with the deity of Eshu, also known as Eshu Elegbara. Eshu is the Yoruba trickster deity, or Orisha, the embodiment of the crossroads, a messenger of the gods. His colors are characteristically red and black, so it goes that God granted Eshu the power to make all things happen and multiply, according to Robert Ferris Thompson. I'm going to speed ahead a little bit and talk a little bit about, and I want us to sort of be aware of the kinds of associations between water and light. Water and light. We waded in the water before this, and I thought it was really appropriate. And looking at, for example, getting there, Untitled, there is a representation of Eshu by this black hat. And the hat is one that Bailey really closely identifies with. He often wears a hat if you've seen him, wide brim hat. There's also in this painting a treasure box with a lid that has a corner of sheet music hanging off the side. There's also a turtle shell that sits on top. A lot more I can say about that. There are also Dakinga signs of the crossroads indicated on the painting as well. So with Windward Coast, there is this reference to Eshu. I'm gonna have to sort of speed through here a little bit. There are 400 disengaged piano keys laid out on the floor, and this was the installation that was done at the Davis Museum at Wellesley College. And each time that the work is installed, it gets done in different configurations. Most recently, it was done at the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans. And there are all these associations of fishing with his father in the Delaware Bay in South Jersey, or the Middle Passage, or Hurricane Katrina, or even the tsunami in Japan a few years ago. But when you come across Windward Coast, it's a multi-sensorial experience. You smell the keys because of the dampness, because of the varnish. You also hear a sound that's projected from a shell in the corner of the room. And I want you to listen closely to hear what those sounds are. Those are the sounds of the keys dropping in his studio in Georgia. And part of what I really enjoy about this is, again, the smell, the walking around, and these keys that are poking out, and you can see the black and white varnish as they rise up and down. And so the whole scene looks like an undulating ocean. It's an undulating ocean of this undulating ocean of black and white keys that kind of speak out. And really what I'm interested in is this black head, this glittered head that peeks out and seems to almost gasp. His eyes are barely open, and is he sleeping? Is he drowning? And what I argue is that this is actually a cry out to Eshu. And as it was installed in the Davis Museum, there was a direct connection between this installation and that painting. And again, time and again, he decorates his head with this beautiful glitter. There's shine. And here's where I thought this was perfect that I was following Imani. I think there's something that has to do with the head being a sacred place, adorning your head as a way of honoring that space of intellectual engagement. And again, I think it's the music that can provide a way for understanding and navigating it. I'm skipping very quickly to this Ellen Gallagher photogravure of Abu Simbel. that is one of which is owned by the Davis Museum. And what you have here is her engagement with, that's installed at the Freud Library. It's a copy of the Freud, of a photograph in Freud's library in London. And what she does, I don't know if you can tell, she replaces the portrait of Ramses II with Sun Ra and also with George Clinton. Wow. And they have gold leaf goatees and eyelashes. And there's also, it's tricked out with, at the bottom with a Cadillac grill. They're beautifully adorned heads that have rolled down the sides of this tomb, this liminal space where black people, this is in Nubia, on the border of Sudan and Egypt, the way in which we can think of the multi-layering of how does one transcend blackness, or not transcend blackness, you don't want to do that. How does one transcend this space that we're in? We don't want to do that. And Alan Gallagher looks to Sun Ra, and she's actually noting specifically his movie Space is the Place. She notes the rocket, the spaceship that comes down, and it's fueled by music to take black people into space where they are then liberated. And so with that in mind, I'm just gonna end here with a clip from Space is the Place where we get to hear Sun Ra talk about what music means.
This music is all a part of another tomorrow, another kind of language. Speaking things of nature, naturalness, the way it should be. Speaking things of blackness, about the void, the endless void, the bottomless pit surrounding you. A better day is breaking. The galaxies are waiting. The planet Earth is waiting. Oh, we sing this song too. A great tomorrow. Oh, we sing this song too. A body's sorrow. Oh, we sing this song too. A great tomorrow. Oh, we sing this song too. A body's sorrow. Why doesn't the earth fall? How can you walk upon it? It's the music. It's the music of the earth, the music of the sun and the stars, the music of yourself, vibrating. Yes, you music too.
Right.
You're all instruments. Everyone's supposed to be playing their part
Come on.
in this vast orchestra
Come
of
on.
the cosmos.
Come on. Yes, ma'am.
Eschew's Ashe, the power to make things happen, and ultimately Radcliffe Bailey and I think some of my panelists face the music.
My name is Matthew D. Morrison. I'm a faculty fellow, also with my colleague Kwami Coleman at New York University in the Tisch School of the Arts, and I am specifically within the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music. I am super excited to be here at this conference, very excited to be here with my comrades, and also to have Hank Willis moderating, and also a special thanks to Deb Willis to seeing it important that there be some sound at this particular conference. So thank you.
Get it.
Thank you. I can listen to it all day. Okay, thank you. No, this is not Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. No, this is not Franz Joseph Haydn. This is Chevalier de Saint George. Afro-French composer, born in Guadeloupe, to a French aristocratic family, plantation owners, to a mother named Anne of African descent. Chevalier de Saint George was not only a classical virtuoso violinist, he was also a master fencer who fenced with Marie Antoinette. He commissioned from Franz Joseph Haydn the Paris symphonies and also premiered them as conductor. How many of us in here, I wonder, are aware of this figure, whether we are not we are within the classical art space or whether or not we are in others, but this is he here. I wanted to make sure to, with this particular conference, to invoke and to bring to the forefront those who have been both pictured as well as those who have composed and created sound that has resonated in many ways in both a American, European, modern cosmopolitan context from the early modern era through the modern era until now. So I'm sort of backtracking from many of my colleagues to really look at what's happening in the 18th century and the turn of the 19th century to think about what does it mean to really consider the sounds in addition to the bodies as part of the bodies of the black presence in Europe. Chevalier de Saint George and Marie Antoinette. George Augustus Bridgetower. I'm not sure how many of us in here know Beethoven's famed Kreutzer Sonata. Well, it was not originally the Kreutzer Sonata. It was written and performed first by Beethoven and Bridgetower, who was an Afro-Polish virtuoso violinist, who also was a contemporary of Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn. All of these folks, you know, studied with one another, went to here, composed there, and this is just what happens in the sort of the canon of Western art music at this particular time as we understand it. But these composers and performers of descent, of African descent, often left out of these conversations, so I wanted to make sure to inject them here. The person who the actual sonata became dedicated to, Beethoven, you know, within his fury, you know, he scratched out the title of the Third Eroica Symphony. It was originally named after Napoleon, and he got pissed at Napoleon, so he scratched that out. So apparently he also got pissed at Bridgetower after they fell out, so he scratched his name out and then dedicated it to Kreutzer. So now we know one of the most famous violin sonatas that's performed all over the world was not, Kreutzer could not even play it. It's documented. He did not have the facility. Beethoven and Bridgetower went around and were dueling with other violinists and pianists to show their virtuosity with one another. So that's its own thing there. This paper is within the tradition of recovering a black presence in the making of Western Europe and its history from the perspective of performance, movement, and sound. Instead of just providing a traditional historical, biographical, and musicological analysis typical of my discipline, I would like to be a bit more imaginative in exploring how the presence, absence, movement, and sounds of black bodies facilitate cosmopolitan performance of a European modern self in the pre-recorded era. So before jazz, it's all here before jazz. Jazz, we sort of see that, you know, as the black presence in European music and such, but it's happening much more before. While ethnic performances of an individual's own white self are imagined within the limited yet freeing scripts of black sounds created by invoking a caricatured, often black other, how does whiteness become articulated through black performance? And in particular, I'm going to think about blackface. More specifically, how does the development of an American popular style impact how nuances and ethnic differences become reified into binary distinctions of black and white? And how do these distinctions become obscured as the, quote, African approach to improvisation through sound and movement laid the foundation for the ways in which blacks and whites articulated popular sound throughout the 19th century in both integrated and segregated spaces, as well as in public and private. Blackface minstrelsy, the first form of native popular music developed in the context of the United States in the 19th century, in which early on white men blackened their faces and performed songs and dances and skits that objectified black sound and movement. It's only thought to be an American phenomenon. As many of my colleagues that I've met here have been documenting, we know that this is very not true. And as my own research shows, blackface has had a lasting impact upon the sound, structures, and circulation of popular music worldwide. Since American popular music developed during the colonial imperial period, in which globalization became more widespread, the global economy of blackface began to also have a significant impact upon the cosmopolitan development of pop music and dance in places like London, Austria, Paris, and Vienna. Although most blackface minstrel troops of the 1850s and 60s were primarily white, mostly ethnically Irish, white Americans, there also emerged a few, quote, what they refer to as authentic black minstrel troops. Excuse me, one of the popular being the Georgia Minstrels. The ubiquity of white minstrels, these being white performers who adorned themselves in blackface, representing blackness on stage, prevailed throughout the mid-19th century. But one of the most famous, if not the most famous and influential minstrel performer of the 19th century was an African-American man from the Northeast named William Henry Lane, commonly referred to by his stage name of, quote, Master Juba. Charles Dickens, in his American Notes of 1842, provides a famous account of what we believe to be Master Juba dancing in the 5-point red light district of downtown New York. Single shuffle, double shuffle, cut and cross cut, snapping his fingers, rolling his eyes, turning in his knees, presenting the backs of his legs in front, spinning about on his toes and heels like nothing but the man's fingers on the tambourine, dancing with 2 left legs, 2 right legs, 2 would listen. Dickens goes on. Clearly he was struck by his movement. I would like to continue reading, but in the interest of time, I will not here. But what I have in this image here is William Henry Lane being pictured in 1848 because he toured through the United Kingdom and wound up actually staying there and died there in obscurity in many ways after he had this huge impact upon the way in which many of the sort of early European popular dances at this time began to really become formulated. In 1848, a reporter in the London Illustrated News remarked on Lane's overall music and performance in England, reported from this very same periodical here, where the master performer appeared as tambourine player and dancer with white serenades, and commenting on the only original dance that came from America, the reporter intones, but the Negro dance is a reality. The Virginia breakdown or the Alabama kick-up, the Tennessee double shuffle, or the Louisiana toe and hail, we know to exist. If they do not, how could Juba enter into their wonderful complications so naturally? How could he tie his legs into such knots and fling them about so recklessly? Or make his feet twinkle until you lose sight of the glory thus conferred? But Juba is a musician as well as a dancer. To him, the intricate management of the Negro tambourine is confined. They didn't use Negro, but I'm substituting it here. And from it, he produces marvelous harmonies. He almost questions whether, upon a great emergency, he could not play a fugue upon it. How the hell do you play a fugue on a tambourine? In this sensational yet revealing account of Juba's performance of African-American performance practices and American dance styles, the critic suggests that the harmonies might have been produced from the tambourine and that on the same instrument, Lane might even perform a fugue. In a contemporary Western conception of the tambourine, this might seem like a hyperbolic statement. But in considering the many descriptions of Juba's polyrhythmic, syncopated, and virtuosic performances, adapting traditional African performance practices to Anglo and European forms, it is possible that the critic was describing, with the Anglo-centric tools that he had available, the polyphonic, polymetric, polymodal performance practices that the audiences witnessed on this London stage. Critically accepted as the most influential American dancer of the mid-19th century, Lane, along with many African-American amateur and professional performers, brought a specifically liberating aspect to the hybridization of Anglo-Celtic and African-American performance practices. Lane's widely popular style and performance led to a watershed moment in the improvised, polyrhythmic, and liberatory way in which an emerging popular society began to move and sound their bodies throughout the late antebellum America and Victorian UK. Even so, the emphatic and angular movements based on joints such as the elbows, knees, and ankles were not solely representations of a disfigured, improper black body as many popular icons and reviews of minstrelsy touted, Rather, I suggest that these posturings reflect, within their imitation and commodification, the spirit of corporeal liberation connected to the traditional West African customs of music and dance from which they derive. As Peter H. Wood notes in his study on traditional West African movement and religion titled Give Me That Knee Bone Bent, quote, straightened knees, hips, and elbows epitomize death and rigidity, while flexed joints embody energy and life. In contemporaneous descriptions of Lane's movement and performance, it is though his flexibility is beyond human, and his angular, quote, noisy, and polyrhythmic improvisations in movement and sound were packed with such embodied energy that his legacy has continued to permeate the liberation of cosmopolitan American and European bodies through popular blackface performance until this day. He is also, as we know very commonly, the inventor of tap. So I'm out of time. I would like to go and talk a little bit about the cakewalk, ragtime, and its ubiquitous influence in Paris, Vienna, and London. But we can save that possibly for some of the Q&A. But what?
He said keep on going. She said go.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I will take. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Only just a couple of minutes. All right. Historian James DeVille notes that the cakewalk developed as a form of parody among enslaved black folk who exaggerated movements that mimicked those of his plantation owners, European ballroom, and other formal social dances. Competitions would be held with the cake as the prize. It was developed in the United States as a popular social dance in the late 19th century for both blacks and whites. Cakewalk competitions were like held in Madison Square Garden. In Vienna, they were so sick of the cakewalk that they were calling it the cake waltz, you know? In Paris, we already know about Fête and Chocolat and all of the various performers who were there, but it was really the way in which folks of various classes, but particularly of the aristocratic classes, began to really adjust and move their bodies in ways they really were not seen before and really were seen as sort of being othered. But to do it within this context of sort of this hybrid style that had already been commodified and created and distributed made it to seem okay. Let's think about twerking, you know what I mean? Okay, so this is the most popular. Initially, they introduced Les Elk, a white couple who toured Paris as well as Europe with a integrated group of minstrels, and they introduced along with like Vernon and Irene Castle in the United States and James Reese Europe introduced the cakewalk there and other ragtime dances. They were the progenitors of this in the European context. So I wanted to show an image of them and also just sort of, you know, also connected to the can-can and these other sorts of folk dances that are happening in these spaces, but the ways in which their bodies become more liberated and more, in this context, exaggerated is very interesting to me. I also, so cakewalks in Germany, in Vienna, in Paris, in London, they were composing their own cakewalks. It wasn't just they were importing music from the United States, they were doing their own stuff. This is a part of the culture in the milieu. Another Les Elk. So this, yes, okay. First of all, this is super high fashion couture. But what we have here, the Florida Creole Girls, they toured, and I'm sure many of us in here are aware of them, but toured throughout these European cosmopolitan centers, were photographed by many of the famous photographers of this time, and they also were very popular in Vienna. And if we think about the way in which Afro-diasporic dance just dominates every form of almost all contemporary, like European and American, so, you know, salsa, merengue, all these things that, you know, people live their lives through in Europe. They were here teaching this at that moment. They were teaching the cakewalk and these other dances in Vienna and in London and such. And then I will end here. Although the cakewalk became a cliche and somewhat a novelty forgotten style, soon to be eclipsed by the introduction of jazz and new styles of African-American popular dance, its impact upon the bodies, psyches, and modern developments of European identity and cosmopolitanism should be closely considered. Such a consideration allows for an understanding of the long history of African and African-American presence in pre-modern and modern Europe, as well as the lasting impact these bodies and their cultural performances had upon European cosmopolitan identity. Much like we discuss various forms of Afro-diasporic dance and music in Europe and the world today. By the time we get to the jazz craze in Europe after World War I, modern European bodies had already been, quote, broken by black sounds and movements via the discussed cases. Deeply rooted in exoticism and praise of African American culture and presence in Europe and many cosmopolitan centers is what I'm really hoping to unpack to get to the complicated ways in which Western Europe has historically dealt with, imagined, and encountered black bodies. This consideration is also important to how we might further unpack how imperial and colonial projects continue to impact the way in which ethnic, racial, and other identities are negotiated. Can we play Gollywog's Cakewalk just very briefly and a little bit lower? Through this brief exploration of lane, ragtime, and the cakewalk, I hope to prompt questions and ideas that force us to engage a pre-jazz sound recording history of black performance in Europe, the impact and movement of commodified black bodies and performative notions of blackness on European identity, and the need to think through these alternative histories and explain the complicated ways in which a white Western European culture has been constructed through discourses of ethnic and racial erasure. This is Gollywog's Cakewalk, one of Claude Debussy's, who was held as, and I agree, held up as one of, really sort of the premier modern composers in France and in Europe. One of his most famous piano suites includes Gollywog Cakewalk, because we know the Gollywog dog was a hugely popular blackface doll that circulated throughout Paris and throughout Western Europe. It was his daughter Choo Choo's favorite doll. So what does Debussy do? He takes ragtime, that he understands as ragtime in early jazz, and creates what now is performed all over the place as one of these sort of most celebrated pieces of Debussy's piano oeuvre. So that's the end of my presentation.
Perfect. Yes, brother, you went in. Yes, brother.
So we'll save, we have 5 minutes for any questions or final comments from the panel.
First of all, I just want to thank all of you. This was fantastic. And
thank you.
Wow. And thank you, Matthew, for mentioning Le Chevalier de Saint John, St. George, because just like Pushkin has been conveniently left out. Someone quoted in the early panel that absence is also a scream. Absolutely. Right? And just like Pushkin is assumed to be Caucasian because by changing Russian literature, he changed Western literature. Chevalier, he tutored Mozart. We lift Mozart up, but we forget this man taught Mozart. So I'm just this is more, not even a question. I'd love for you to comment on this erasure that you alluded to. Why is it so convenient for the hegemonic power to just wipe these things away?
Well, it's a part of the imperial and colonial project. To me, I 100%. So I'm 100% agree. It's part of the imperial and colonial project. Western discourse of art and music. Frederick Douglass was a violinist. Joseph Douglass, his grandson, was the first black violinist to tour Europe as a concert violinist. You know what I mean? For a very long time, I thought I was the only black person to play the violin, aside from my colleague Latanya, who I was in high school with. If I had known this history, then my awareness would have been very different. So it's also a part of just the way that discourse has become a part of these imperial projects too, I believe, which is why this is necessary.
Right.
I did. Hello? Hi. I'm over here. Over here to you. Oh, I'm to your right. Yes.
Hi.
Hey. How y'all doing? This was wonderful. I have a question for Imani. You were theorizing a little bit about your sound as you were singing, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the projects you're undertaking as a PhD candidate that have something to do with the way that you are thinking through your sound as a performer, and where you might take this. And clearly this is cursory and maybe a beginning, but I'm just curious about how you're thinking about some of your other work.
I'm not a PhD candidate yet. I'm a master's student, but hopefully I'll apply.
My bad.
We'll see. No, that's good. That's what I clarify. But yeah, right now I'm really interested in performativity and spectacle as it relates to sound and visual culture. One of the people that I'm writing about, the person I'm writing about for my master's thesis is Sister Gertrude Morgan, who was a well-known, what they call outsider artist or folk artist from Alabama, got famous in New Orleans, and had big exhibits with Bill Fagan and other people, New Orleans Museum of Art. But I'm really interested in her visual aesthetic, but I'm interested in her visual aesthetic as a spectacle, how she dressed in all white, how she went through the streets of New Orleans and used her megaphone to preach, which I'm interested in the sonics of black preaching traditions as well as the orality of that. And I'm also interested, she had an all-white prayer room that she would invite people into her home in this one room that was all white. She would do services and pray over them. So for me, I'm just, the visual culture is really captivating me more than I thought it would, but I'm really interested in the performativity as it relates to visual culture and the orality. And the last thing I'll say about Sister Gertrude, I'm also interested in, very excited by quote-unquote black vernacular sound. I'm working with an archive of 1937 to 1939 collected sounds from throughout the North and South of black Americans singing spirituals, some ring shout singing, some prayers and other things. So somewhere in there, when I apply, that's what I'll be saying I want to do, but we'll see what happens.
There's just one other thing I wanted to say about the Chevalier Saint-Georges that I think is important for our story. He actually tutored Alexandre Dumas, the father of Dumas, in fencing. And he taught, the two of them developed this athletic and really different type of sword play, which when Alexandre Dumas Fils wrote his book that we all know about, Count of Monte Cristo, all of them, that is based on the sword play that he learned from the Chevalier. So that the way they move, the way they dance, whenever you watch, because this, of course, Dumas is another black writer who people don't often know is black, but that was where, that when you look, the Three Musketeers, that's where that came from. Just wanted us all to know that.
Thank you, Misan, for your wonderful comments, and everyone for your wonderful comments. This concludes our panel, and we're going to break for lunch. Thank you so much.